Hello and welcome back to DriveDriverDriven. I'm Humble and we're back on the Blunicorn rebuild. This time we're moving forward in the car and we're taking care of the nose today. There's a lot to show you, so let me spin the camera around and get to it. We have our nose set up on the body stand. I'll show you why in a moment. If we walk over to the car, I've sort of pre-set up our splitter. There's a few things to look for. It's not really final mounted. It's just held on with a couple of through bolts that I use for my tow hook. There are basically three main critical components of the nose assembly. You have the splitter, of course. You have the actual nose mounts, and then you have the bodywork. The way these mounts are set up is sort of the splitter depends on the mounts, and the mounts depend on the bodywork, and the bodywork sort of depends on everything else. When you're putting the nose on the car, you're going to really watch for the flange as it settles here, and then it settles here, and then against this side here. And you're going to do the same thing that you did on the rear, which is to like lift it up and level it out until you get this gap set right, this gap set right, and then if those are okay, this gap around here will also be set right. Don't worry too much about where the nose seals here on the splitter. We'll fill those gaps with some foam tape or whatever as need be. Another thing with the splitter is there are spacers that it ships with. So currently, my splitter is just butt up against the bottom of the car. But you have these splitters that Ultima ships with the kit. And you have, I think it's like a 2 mil spacer and a 3 mil spacer. Now you may need none of these, one or the other, or both. It just depends on where the splitter sits, where it puts these mounts, and then where these mounts put the rest of the nose. There is a heim that goes in here, and this is the hinge. This is the relocated hinge for the RS, and these blocks are why we had to remove the original mount assembly, which sat here in the corner. It's because they actually rivet to the radiator cage to set their position. Now, the reason these are loose is because the position of these mounts on the cage depends on the position of the splitter, which depends on the location of the bodywork, and you kind of see where I'm going with this. So you have to pick one to start with. For me, the easiest one to start with was the splitter, so I can use it to support the rest of the assembly, whether or not the holes are drilled correctly. So I have these two holes for my tow hook, which is different from the Ultima tow hook. And they support the splitter sort of centrally through the middle. And that allows me to set these mount blocks in place, at least temporarily. And it'll take a little bit of load, but not too much. You can see it's moving here. And that's because I only drilled these two holes. If you look at the spacer assembly, they're drilled several times for bolts that go through the splitter and mount it more rigidly to the bottom of the car. We're going to get to that later, but right now we just need to set the position of these mount blocks. So I've already done one test fit, and there's a couple of places that I need to modify to suit my car. One is I've moved a couple of the radiator mount positions, which instead of having little arms that stick out here, they mount up underneath this bar. And then likewise, my condenser bolts here on the forward bar and then back down below. So I need to clearance for these, and I need to make sure that when everything's in place, that the opening for the radiator works with my radiator setup, which I've already been warned that it may not. So we'll discover that in a little bit. Looking at the nose here upside down on the stand, these are the pivots where the nose now mounts to the chassis. And the overall design you can see is a much larger opening, and we have this sort of air duct that's right behind the opening now. And this takes some of the stagnant air that sits in front of the radiator and gives it an exit path up each side of the radiator exit, and bleeds off some of that air pressure. So here on the back you can see where I marked out and had the clearance for our condenser mounts. And then after talking to Jeff at the factory, you have to do a little bit of clearancing in the corner here as well to clear the edge of the radiator frame. And that allows basically this corner of the nose to sit further in, and makes room for just that corner. And that's all you need to do is just chop out a little piece here. Now I will say, I did mention in the last video working with all the fiberglass, but if you are working with fiberglass and you're sanding or cutting or any of that stuff, make sure you're wearing a respirator and all your other safety gear. Mostly because fiberglass dust is super fine, and it's a hell of a desiccant, just dries out your skin and everything else, but you definitely don't want it in your lungs. The tool I was using to make these cutouts is just whatever, like just a plunge and cut tool on the Dremel. It cuts super easily and makes very quick work of getting through the fiberglass, and then you can go through afterward and either clean it up with the same tool or hit it with a file. And so that's what I did, and it leaves a really nice finish. Not that you're going to see much of it because we're going to be treating all this with an undercoat, the same kind of undercoat that I put on the bottom of the car, which will help protect it, and especially in the archways where the wheels are, will help protect from stone chips and cracking. So next up, we're going to put the nose back on the car and do our test fit and see if we got enough here. All right, first stab with the nose back on. Now you can see sort of where I was talking about. So this is how the pivot sits. This is just a through bolt to capture the heim joint in there. As you can see, there's just a little gap here, but you can see the splitter itself also flexes a little bit. Not too worried about that now because, again, it's not final mounted. You can see that corner where we've clearanced, and we need to take a little bit more off of there just to be able to pull the nose back, because if I close it, this gap here is just a little too big still. And then down here, of course, we have a gap. And then on the other side, same thing. It just needs to come back a little bit. It's okay down here. Not quite lining up great there, but again, taking a little bit more. And down here, our gap is a little bit big, but we'll see if we can't close that up a bit. But otherwise, we're getting there. We're getting close. All right, so sorry no time lapse between of cutting, fitting, and measuring, but it's taken a few tries. Most of that's kind of boring work, but I showed you where you make your cuts. Second step is getting the heim joints set right, but we're pretty close. So down under here, if you look, I've got our C-clamps holding these mount plates more firmly to the radiator cage. And what was happening is when I put the nose on, the front of the splitter would droop. And even if I supported it in the middle with the jack, it would still droop down on the sides. So with that more rigidly held, I could get better placement and more accurate placement, I should say, of these guys, which meant more accurate placement of the nose proper. And that also meant that I could better clearance and test fit up underneath that duct. And all told, now we have, this is about as good as our shut line is going to get. It's a little big here, but we're right on the rubber stoppers. Our gap up through here it's a little tight in the corner once everything's held, but we might have a little rubbing here, which I'll need to address. And same on the other side. It's the same area right through here. It's a little tight, and I might just have to sand that back a little bit. And but our body gap is set. Again, we're right on the bumpers, and our wheel opening is set. And otherwise, it looks really good. If we open up the hood, you can see I probably opened that up a little bit bigger than it needed. I just wanted to make sure that we clear the corner okay, and now it does, thankfully. While we're on the topic of body pre-fit, I wanted to discuss the body latches that I'm switching to. Now, previously I had our Ultima body catches, which sit right up here on our panel. You can see the little dimple there for it, and everything positively locks, and there's release cables inside the side pod in the cabin. And for what they're worth as a factory option, they work perfectly fine. If you keep your car on the street, you won't have any issues with it. They work great. The problem I ran into is when the fire happened, the cables had burned through and melted, and it made it so that the clamshell, the rear clamshell, could not be opened by the time I had come to a stop. And so the firefighters basically destroyed this area where the fuel filler is, and this area on the rear clamshell to basically destroy the latches and get the clamshell open so they could fight the fire. I'm switching to latches that can be operated outside of the car and independently, so that in the event of another fire, I won't have the same issue again. So these are arrow catch latches. You've probably seen these on a bunch of race cars. They open up, they have a positive lock and a positive pin capture. They've been on other Ultimas. There's different places where you can mount them rigidly. I suggest down in this area where you have more material in the side pod to capture versus like up in here where this part is a little more flimsy. And in the front, I'm using this style of arrow catch, which has a positive engagement besides the lock, but the two halves actually positively interlock together, and it'll bridge this gap through here. But in tightening it, it will sort of pull the front clamshell back and positively lock the body into place. That's why I'm going to use these. And they'll have to sit, something like this or in this area. I'd like to put them a little bit lower, but I think it'll interfere with the RS badge, so it'll probably have to sit a little bit higher. Another option might be up in here, but really I want the latching action to either pull it down or pull it back. All right, on again, off again, on again, off again. So the nose is pretty much ready to go. I had to pull the pivots out and put the washers and nuts on. So these are going to be ready to go when it goes in the car again for its final check fit. I have these little rubber nubs in now. They weren't in previously. They sit back about 11.5 centimeters from the edge here. That puts it basically right in the middle of that panel. And the last thing I did was I sort of pre-drilled a little hole in here because On the splitter, there's a aluminum kind of cone-shaped locator that fits into this hole. And I used that locator, placed it in there, and then drilled a hole through on this side so that when I final fit the nose on the splitter for the last time, I can just run a drill bit down from the inside through the splitter and then have an accurate locating cone to hold the nose in place. On the car itself now, I have the mounts riveted in place. They're pretty solidly located on either side now. I'm happy with their final position. Lastly, it's to drill the holes in the splitter and to put the nutserts in the bottom of the radiator cage assembly so we can final mount our splitter and finally and fully support the weight of the nose. So what I did was I took our spacers, and normally if you set up the Ultima tow hook, you can use these 3 locating holes to drill into and hold the splitter itself and then run the rest of the locating holes. But since I'm running a different tow hook, I have these 2 holes here. What I did is I put these spacers up underneath the car and made sure everything was square, and then I drilled through them on the car, and now I can transfer them over to the splitter, run some bolts through to hold everything in place, and then drill all the rest of the holes to run inserts through to support the splitter on the chassis. The holes are drilled in the radiator floor area, and I've also drilled all the holes out in the splitter, but I wanted to point something out before I put the splitter on the car while it was easy to do so. So these are all the holes that are transferred from the spacers. What I've done here is I've taken a countersink bit to drill out the hole a little bit so that these kind of conical washers can sit in that hole, and then the flat part of the washer can grab the splitter more evenly and spread out the load across the larger surface area. And I've done that for all the holes, including the ones that go up through the actual clamshell mounts. And on these holes, there's just a washer and a bolt that goes through. It's not anything like these. It's just a much larger nut and bolt. You want to go ahead and do that. Likewise, with the talk about fiberglass dust, with the carbon dust, it's very critical that you wear a mask when you're working with the carbon stuff, because carbon dust is far more carcinogenic than like asbestos, and it works kind of similarly when it gets in your lungs, so you don't want to breathe this stuff in. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and flip this guy over and we'll stick it on the car. That was a nightmare, but we got it on. What happened was one of the bolts in the back got snagged in the nutsert and broke. So I had to drill a new hole, pull everything out, put a new nutsert in, redo all that on that side, and then put everything back in. And then when I got to putting this body mount on, it was just a hair off. So I had to clearance the hole a little bit to get the bolt in from underneath. But other than that, it's all in and sturdy, bolted in. If I pull the camera under here, these are the smaller M5 bolts with these kind of dimple-dyed washers that spread the load and hold the panel up. These are the 2 bolts for my tow hook that come through. I don't have the bolt there because I'm missing a dimple dyed washer, So I'll have to figure that out. And then over there in the corner, that's where I screwed that up. But that's going to be our little secret. No one's going to know. Other than that, this panel is totally done and in place and hard mounted. So now we can get the nose back on. But before we do, there's one more thing I want to show you. This wouldn't be a proper splitter install if I didn't do this. Ultima probably advises against this, but I wanted to show you that it will hold the weight. It'll hold your weight if you stand on it, and it has to. I'm 200 pounds, and it's got to hold up to that kind of force for, you know, all the downforce and everything that the nose is going to provide now. So it's tough. Like, I could not do that with the Evo splitter, and with the RS mounted to the chassis now, you can see it's very, very rigid. So well done, Ultima, for improving that design. All right, and there we go. It's basically dark out now, but we got the nose on for the last time. We have a good fit in our corners. The hinges are set. I don't know how well we'll be able to see this, but our gaps look good. I'll have to film that when the sun's out again, but otherwise, man, I love that blue. I liked the old blue, but this is a really strong contender for the replacement. It's growing on me more and more. If I grab the light, there you go. We have a body pre-fit basically done. There's a couple more things I got to do, like install the body latches. But once those are done, we'll be ready to tear all that off and start the final assembly. It's been a long day. I know I didn't film as much of the process as I do usually, and it's just because there's so much fiddly bits and just taking care of transferring holes from one thing to another, etc. And it was just hard to film in the areas that I was working. I'm so glad to be at this point. So that's about 90 to 95% of the way through the body pre-fit. There's a few more things left to do, like the rear bulkhead and the body latches, the arrow catches that I pointed out before. But for now, I'm really happy with the progress we've made, and took a fair whack at it today, just getting the nose complete. Thank you for sticking around, and I'll see you guys next time.